Hello and Happy New Year. I'm Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our program today on behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. It feels like it's been an eternity since we saw each other last in early December. But here we are again with our brand new series for the year 2025. And quite a series it is, with programs on all kinds of wonderful, inspiring, important, true stories of history. Today we are celebrating an unsung hero whose identity was discovered mere months ago. It's almost like a hot off the press story. Unusually, instead of a film today, we had you listen to a radio program with our friend of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, ELEANOR Beardsley, who is the Paris correspondent of National Public Radio. We met her years ago when she came on one of our trips. We organized a trip called Journey on the Road to Freedom, retracing the footsteps of Aristides de Sousa Mendes, our hero, and the refugees that he saved. And at that point, ELEANOR came along on our trip and documented it for National Public Radio. So I'm just so delighted that she's taken the time to join us here today. She will be our
Okay.
first speaker, and she will sort of narrate the story for you. Following ELEANOR Beardsley, we're going to hear from Dr. Susan Zuccotti, who is one of the leading world's experts on World War II in France and in Italy. She's going to talk about sort of the nature of the occupation in Paris, what it meant to resist, what it meant for a photographer to do what he did when he did it. So she is our expert on today's program of the wider history. And then the third speaker coming to us from Toronto will be Dr. Lewis Kaplan, and he's an authority on photography, and in particular, photography in the period that we are addressing today. So he will show you photography or photographs by different photographers, and he will open your eyes so that you're able to see these images in the way that the photographer intended. So without further ado, well, actually, before I turn it over to my speakers, let me just mention that you are welcome to ask questions. We encourage you to ask questions, but you will remain muted. But that's what the chat function is for. So you will have to type your questions out into that chat box. I will be functioning today as your moderator, so I'll be gathering your questions and asking as many as I can to today's speakers. So now, without further ado, ELEANOR Beardsley, please take the floor.
Olivia, thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be part of this program, and I'm really honored that so much attention was given to this story because it is an important story. So I just want to tell you how I got involved with it. I was reading this series in Le Monde newspaper this fall. It was a 6-part series, and I was approached by Le Monde. They asked if I would like to interview the reporter who did the investigation, and I thought, well, sure, I'll meet him, but I didn't think I would do a story because, it wasn't my investigation, it was theirs. So, but, of course I met him, and that's when everything changed. So here is Philippe Broussard. That's him at his desk, surrounded by all of these copies of the pictures. He's an investigative reporter at Le Monde. And I met with him for about an hour, and he told me just, every detail of the story. And it was so beautiful. By the end, I just wanted to cry. And it was just so heartrending. And that's when I knew that I was going to do something. I was going to do a report on their investigation. And it all started with this. This is an album, a photo album that was found in a flea market by a friend of Broussard's in 2020 in the south of France. She was a documentary filmmaker and a photo collector, Stephanie Collot, and I met her. And she said she hadn't found anything of value that day. So when she saw this battered old album, she decided to open it. And she says she was just gobsmacked because it was page after page of these black and white little pictures of occupied Paris, just occupied Paris between 1940 and 42. But there was no name on it. She said there was a little note at the beginning, and that's that. And she said, you know, if you find this album, please have the courage to look at it. And she said she just felt like someone had sent a message in a bottle and she had just found it. So the first thing she did was to call Broussard. She described him as very pugnacious, and she said, we've got to find out who this is. She knew that if anybody could do it, he would. So that's how their 4-year investigation began. Now, it was very complicated, and there were a lot of false leads and dead ends, but basically they found these same pictures in a couple of other places, and that's what finally led them to find the photographer. So one of the first places they found the pictures, a large collection, was at the Museum of National Resistance in Champigny-sur-Marne, which is right to the east of Paris. It's easy to get there on the train. And I went there and I met the archivist, Manuel Mango Niquez. Here he is, and he took me up in the offices where they had about 700 pictures, and most of them were being stored. And he showed me, you know, he said he took them out, you know, wearing gloves, as you see. You know, he explained how the person who took these pictures would be facing a huge risk. Nobody was allowed to take pictures outside except for, you know, authorized propagandists. And it wasn't just the pictures, there were the comments on them. You might want to go back to that last picture. On every picture was not only the date and the time of day, but a mocking comment. So in the museum, they showed the pictures in a way, they displayed several of the pictures, about a dozen, and they had them where you could look at the picture and the mocking comment. Those were actually copies that were displayed. And you know, in the comments, the author, the photographer, called the Nazis Fritzes, which was a derogatory term. And so I'll show you this one picture. It's these 3 Nazis in front of a metro stop. There they are, and it says, Mr. Fritz doesn't seem happy to be photographed. Look at his amiable air being photographed. There was another one that showed a German soldier looking at a map, and it said, Fritz is wondering where his caucus will rot in Europe one day. And also this photographer really didn't like when he would see women collaborators with Nazi officers, he would say, in one picture it said, Fritz is eating oysters with 2 chicks, you know. So these photos were actually given into the museum in 1999 by a man whose father was in the resistance, and he didn't know who the photographer was, and his father was dead. And so the exhibit was named after him. It was the Paul Leduc exhibit. And Mango Niquez told me to finally know the author of these photos was so magnificent and so important. He said they were already used, they're exceptional, and they're used by researchers, but to be able to put a name and a face on them was so important because their whole collection in the museum, the collections were organized around the lives of the different resistance. So this display is going to be changed and renamed, and all that is to come. Now, the photographer, Broussard, told me when they first started looking, they really didn't know who they were looking for, a man, a woman. It could have been a Nazi soldier himself. And if you look at a map where some of the pictures that he took were taken, he told me that, you know, you would have a picture because they put the time of day in maybe the east of Paris and one an hour later in the west. And so it would be almost impossible to get from one end to the other because nobody had cars. There were no private cars. People rode bikes, but they imagined maybe he was taken around. Maybe it was a soldier. Maybe, you know, so in the beginning, they were even looking for maybe a Nazi soldier. Anyway, the investigation was slow. He said he became like a cop in front of a cold case. He was frustrated and obsessed. He said he'd be at dinner with his family and his wife would look at him and go, "You're not with us, are you? You're in your investigation." He would say, "Yeah." So this last spring, he said they almost gave up. He almost gave up. They just weren't getting anywhere. You know, people were old or dead. Most people were dead who would have anything to say. And you know, he called Stephanie Collot and he told her, "We're going to have to go to publish. We can't keep spending time on this." And then they had a breakthrough. They found another collection of these pictures owned by a woman who worked at the perfume counter of the department store Le Printemps. This is an old department store from the 19th century, a grand store. That's a picture from 1944, but it's still there. You can go shopping there today. And Broussard told me, he said he had a feeling about this place. And so the son of this woman who was losing his memory, that's who they met. So those were his mother's pictures. And then Broussard said he'll never forget the day. Last April, he got a call from the store archivist, and she said, "We may have found the person you're looking for." They found an internal newsletter from the store with one of the pictures and a name. And here he is. His name was Raoul Minot. And everyone was just, they said his face was so full of goodness. And he was a handkerchief salesman at Le Printemps. And this picture actually was discovered after the series was published in Le Monde. There were so many people who read that series. It was very popular. And a reader who worked at the French Ministry of Defense in Veterans Affairs actually found it in military archives. He was able to because Minot had fought himself in World War I against the Germans. So back to the investigation, Minot had taken all of those pictures along with his wife, Marthe. They developed them at the Store Photo Studio, which explains how they got the paper in wartime Paris and the solutions to develop them. And Broussard said he imagined this group of resistance working together out of that store because there are other stories of resistance out of the Printemps. But the store clearly also harbored traitors because someone denounced them. And Broussard had a copy of the anonymous denunciation letter, which was also published in Le Monde. And here it is. And someone put it in the mail to the police. And it says basically, you should investigate the Minot household. They both work at Le Printemps. And, it just describes sort of what they were doing. And that's exactly what happened. The police went to their apartment, seized hundreds of photos, seized the little Kodak Brownie camera that Minot had held under his coat to take the pictures. And he was turned immediately over to the Gestapo. He was interrogated and deported to Mauthausen and then Buchenwald. And he never came back. After the war, Marthe Minot searched for him in vain. And she used that picture in this document. There were thousands of deportees pouring back into Paris, streaming in, and she never did find him. And he wasn't linked to any formal resistance groups, so she couldn't get any kind of war pension or anything. She eventually died, and the couple had a daughter who died very young, even before the mother, and he was forgotten and seemingly lost in obscurity until this investigation. And reader reaction has been huge to this. Minot is going to be recognized now as a hero, as someone who died for France. There's going to be a ceremony at some point. And Broussard told me he was able to find out what happened to him because that was in the military archives. In the spring of 1945, he was in a death march out of Buchenwald. He was sick and he was handed over somehow to American soldiers, and he died probably in their custody in a hospital sometime in April 1945, but he died a free man. His body is likely in an unmarked grave in Bavaria, where they have found some unknown French bodies. And Broussard said there were two young Frenchmen who had helped Minot on that death march, and he actually found the widow of one of those men and spoke to her on the phone. She was 95 years old. She's still alive, actually. And he asked, did your husband ever mention Raoul Minot? And she told him, oh, yes, my husband always felt so terrible that he was unable to help the man from Le Printemps. So Broussard said this story for him, he couldn't give up because it was bigger than World War II. He said this was for him the story of a normal man who tried to fight, even if he's in front of the biggest army in the world at the time and in front of colleagues who could be traitors. He said it's the story of courage, of the love of his wife who tried to find him. He told me it was a universal story, and these are the kind of small stories like this that help us understand the bigger picture. So that was basically the conversation, and that's why I thought, my God, I've got to do something on this investigation.
Wow, Eleanor. So now let's turn the floor over to Susan. Susan, go ahead.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you to all the staff who work with Olivia to help me make this presentation. And thank you to the audience for being here and for your interest. Raoul Minot was exceptional in many, many ways. We all recognize his courage, patriotism, anti-German sentiment, and determination to resist. Equally impressive, however, is the rapidity with which he made his decision and began his own personal anti-German activities. The German army occupied Paris on June 14, 1940, less than 4 weeks after they crossed the border into France on May 15th. Raoul began his photography barely 2 weeks after the Germans arrived in Paris. Raoul began on or about June 30th. At that early date, there were very few resistors in Paris. Raoul was among the first. I would therefore like to talk to you today about this aspect of Raoul's resistance activities, the broader context in which he made his decisions, namely the nature of public opinion in Paris. During the first weeks of the German occupation, Parisians and other Frenchmen were desperately trying to process the rapid and mortifying French defeat. People were humiliated, angry, and bewildered, but they were not focusing on resistance. Millions throughout France were asking who was responsible for this terrible French defeat and placing the blame on the politicians of the detested French Third Republic. Millions also were simply relieved that the war was over and immensely grateful to the widely revered Marshal Philippe Pétain for arranging and signing the Franco-German armistice on June 17th. In addition, Paris was strangely empty during the summer of 1940 because some 2/3 of all the Parisians had fled to the south in June as the German army was approaching. Most made their way home to Paris during the summer and early fall of 1940, but still few were thinking of resistance. Raoul was among the exceptions to this general confusion and passivity. Also, during these early days of the occupation, Parisians and other French men and women were wondering how to deal with the Germans. With some exceptions, the German occupiers, surprisingly enough, at first acted with unexpected moderation and restraint. Initially, both Pétain, now the head of the new Vichy regime, and the Germans themselves seemed to have believed in the possibility of a Franco-German friendship and collaboration. During the summer of 1940, it looked as if the British would soon be defeated. After the British defeat, Pétain assured his compatriots, Germany, France, and Britain, along with the Benelux countries, would come together in some kind of Western European alliance of conservative, authoritarian, but stable governments. Therefore, the German occupation of Paris and northern France would end at that point after the British defeat. Why, the argument ran among the average person, why risk one's life and resist if the occupation was going to be temporary? The French population must wait, Pétain urged, and many long-suffering French men and women agreed. Attentisme, waiting, was the word. Collaboration was the recommended policy. Always among the minority who rejected Pétain's policies, Raoul Minot refused to wait. As we all know, the German occupation became much more violent with time. French attitudes changed and hardened, and individual French resistance developed into an organized armed military resistance with a capital R. Why did the French public opinion gradually change? First, it was not long before severe food shortages and rationing in Paris and throughout northern France became not just an irritant, but a major hardship. Second, the British were not defeated, and it began to appear that the German occupation would not be so temporary after all. That appearance became a reality when the German army invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Clearly, the war was not going to end soon. The invasion of the Soviet Union also ended the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact of August 1939, which had obligated French communists to refrain from anti-German activities. Suddenly, thousands of the most anti-Nazi activists in France were released and free to engage not just in individual nonviolent resistance, but in well-organized military resistance as well. Thirdly, by the summer of 1941, the German occupation had become significantly harsher and more brutal than before. Some German brutality was in response to the increasingly violent French resistance, French military resistance, as Germans arrested and tortured suspects and shot hundreds of hostages. But other brutal provocations by the Germans in 1941, early 1941, included the mass arrests and deportations of Jews throughout France. In Paris, the population looked on helplessly as nearly 4,000 foreign Jewish men were rounded up and interned in Paris in mid-May 1941, another 4,000 in August 41, and more than 1,000, this time French Jews, still only men, in December 1941. Then came the huge and devastating roundups of 12,884 foreign Jewish men, women, and children in Paris on June 16th, 1942, and another 11,012 foreign Jews in the southern zone of unoccupied France were arrested a month later. Deportations of these innocents to Auschwitz ensued, and French public opinion began to change. Time does not permit me to give you examples of the increasing resistance actions and brutal German responses during the months that followed. But let's now return to Raoul Minot. After a year as one of the first and few nonviolent individual resistors in Paris, Raoul became increasingly aware of the more violent, growing, organized resistance and the horrifying, brutal German punitive responses. Having already distinguished himself as one of the first French resistors, Raoul at that point could have quietly ceased, or at least minimized his own efforts as the danger to his own survival increased. But he did not do that. Instead, he continued his heroic efforts until his arrest on February 8th, 1943, and his deportation that following April. For 2 full years in deportation, he suffered agonizing torments at Mauthausen, Buchenwald, and Flossenburg. He barely survived the death marches at the end of the war, death marches of prisoners at the end of the war. And he died from exposure, exhaustion, starvation, and disease on April 28, 1945, just 10 days before the end of the war in Europe. A hero forgotten for 80 years, we are here to honor him today. Thank you.
Wow, Susan, that was so moving. Now let's hear from our third speaker, Lewis Kaplan. Lewis, take us in a new direction. Teach us how to see.
Thank you very much, Olivia, for this kind invitation to join this event to celebrate and to recognize Raoul Minot. My prepared remarks today are entitled Sarcasm as a Mode of Resistance, regarding Raoul Minot's photographs of occupied Paris, 1940 to 1942. At the conclusion of Little History of Photography, 1931, the renowned German Jewish critic Walter Benjamin, who would move to Paris himself a few years later to try to escape the Nazis, insisted that the modern photographer does not only take pictures. Rather, a photographer tells stories using words and images that hang together and depend on one another. He asks his readers to contemplate the meaning of photographic literacy with these rhetorical questions. But shouldn't a photographer who cannot read his own pictures be no less accounted an illiterate? Will not the inscription become the most important part of the photograph? In asking this second question to the French photographer of resistance, Raoul Minot, and his hundreds of clandestine photos of Paris under Nazi occupation between 1940 and 42, I want to argue that his use of captions follows Benjamin's lead, and we cannot underestimate their significance. We need such captions, not only to get a better sense of the specific context in which these images were made, but also to access the photographer's perspective regarding what we are seeing in these photos that passed under the radar of the Nazis. One recalls the decree on the 16th of September, 1940, that prohibited, quote, photography in the open air or from the back of an enclosure or from inside a home, end of quote. This suppression of citizen photography signals the Nazis' awareness of its importance as a weapon in war. It also gives new meaning to the illicit photo shot by Minot with his Kodak Brownie camera 1 week later at Saint-Cloud, where a German officer gives him a dirty look that could easily have led to his arrest then and there. One of the most distinctive features of Minot's photographic style is its snarky tone. I propose that we consider Minot's sarcasm as itself a mode of resistance to the Nazi rule of Vichy France, and to appreciate the fact that so many of these oppositional photos and their running commentaries are mocking, biting, and laced with Black humor. This attitude must not be forgotten, and they testify to his active resistance via words and images. Philippe Roussard makes this point in Le Monde, asserting that Minot's photographs, quote, exude a caustic sense of humor, end of quote. And also he writes, some of the images have handwritten notes with short, punchy remarks filled with a saucy, very Parisian sarcasm. This sarcastic sensibility is the means by which this political dissenter is able to channel his resentment. It functions as a defense mechanism, a means to protect and armor Minot against his enemies, even as it binds him further to his comrades. To register one facetious example, Minot secretively shoots 8 German soldiers who are pondering which fabric to buy. While Minot mockingly proclaims that the matter is serious, we know that his getting caught while shooting or distributing this image would have been a lot more. In certain ways, Minot's photographs share similarities with the deployment of bitter irony and dark humor in the work of Jewish photographers at the beginning of the Nazi era, who sought to transmute their suffering and tears into laughter, but where the laughter often sticks in the throat. One might compare Roman Vishniak's similarly clandestine and sarcastic photos on the streets of Berlin in the fall of 1933, where he shoots his daughter Mara under the pretext of a family snap, thereby masking his real intention to illustrate the rise of anti-Semitic persecution as witnessed in this racist contraption designed to show the superiority of Aryan skulls. Vishniak mocked the so-called plastometa as sheer lunacy. Minot was not afraid to register his outrage via sarcastic words and images either. There is the darkest of humors in the caption that accompanies the photo of a German soldier looking at a map that translates, and Eleanor referred to it already, Mr. Fritz wonders where his carcass will rot one day. The strategy here is to fantasize victory with a death wish cast upon the Nazi oppressor from the vantage point of the occupied subject. In addition, Minot's repeated stereotypical use of the pejorative Mr. Fritz as a stand-in for all German soldiers is designed to take away individuality. The carnivalesque strategy of comic inversion carries over in this word-image combination taken at the Place Vendôme on June the 8th, 1941, where the victors and the vanquished exchange places. Quote, at the Fête de la Nation, the Fritzes are astonished that the vanquished are enjoying themselves while the victors are bored. Sigmund Freud had explained the purpose of such tendentious humor in his jokes book, to make the enemy appear small, inferior, and ridiculous. Clearly, Minot excelled at this mode of mockery while aiming his phototext barbs at Mr. Fritz. In another early image on the Rue de Rivoli, he derisively calls the Germans our protectors. Or Minot documents resistance in the graffiti, "Aber Hitler," down with Hitler, on a building in Bécon. Here, the inscription is embedded in the photographic image rather than outside it. This simple oppositional speech act takes the Führer down a notch. Then Minot adds his own caption, beckoning toward liberation and giving his comrades some hope, embodied in the leader of the French Free Forces, Charles de Gaulle, in London exile. As Minot writes, de Gaulle has at least one admirer, and he's showing it. Now, there are many examples of photos taken by Nazi perpetrators and occupiers, whether Wehrmacht soldier Heinrich Jost's images of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, or this demeaning photograph on the left of a Nazi soldier mocking an Orthodox Jew's hair in the Soviet Union, both from 1941. Perhaps one can say that Minot's sarcasm directly counters such examples. Then there are those Nazi photographs making propaganda for the occupation of Paris, such as Heinrich Hoffmann's publicity shot of Adolf Hitler at the Eiffel Tower on the right, or on the left, you see the Nazi propaganda poster that was also shot by Minot and is in the album that Eleanor also showed you before. Such images force reflection about the biases of the lenses through which we view things. In the case at hand, we can compare Minot's photos with those taken by the French collaborationist photographer André Zucca, hired by the German magazine Signal. Viewing Paris through a Nazi lens and in color, Zucca depicts how well everything was going. Full cafes, smiling, stylish women, as you see here, in hip sunglasses, German soldiers taking in the sights, including a visit to the zoo, where everyone appearing happy and content under the new order. In contrast, Minot's somber black and white photos show streets mostly deserted of Parisians, but with German troops everywhere. And when the French do appear, we see, as here, the families of prisoners or forced laborers working at gunpoint at a detention camp. Minot's snide comments articulate the voice of the oppressed, putting a negative spin on everything that crosses his path. He testifies to how sarcastic images and captions speak bitter truths and laughter to power. And when the polar bear appears at the zoo, the same one in Minot, it becomes a source of wordplay and mockery. Read the caption. These gentlemen say they prefer the bear, O-U-R-S, to the USSR, URRS. Now, as we know from our previous speakers, Minot suffered a tragic fate when denounced by an informant and eventually shipped to Buchenwald in April 1943. Here, the French resistor was used as forced labor and his harsh treatment continued when sent out on a death march at the end of World War II. He died on April the 28th, 1945, 5 days after his liberation by the Americans. It would have consoled him to know that even in the brutal death camps, photography served as an act of resistance, bearing witness to the atrocities. I'm referring here to those Jewish prisoners who smuggled a camera into Auschwitz and who were able somehow to document the horrors of the gas chambers undetected, with 4 infamous photos in August of 1944. Those, quote, 4 pieces of film snatched from hell, end of quote, as George Didi Huberman refers to them, that made their way back to Polish resistance fighters. While not as extreme as those death camp photos, Raoul Minot's heroic images of occupied Paris represent that same fighting spirit, that same defiant desire to use the camera as a weapon, to furtively and sarcastically shoot what the Nazi oppressors and their Vichy collaborators did not want the world to see. Thank you very much.
Wow. I'm sitting here riveted after these three amazing presentations. There are a ton of questions in the chat box. Audience members, I encourage you to continue typing in your questions. We're going to now have a few minutes of announcements, so this is a nice opportunity for you to type out any more questions you may have. So let me tell you about what we have upcoming here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So our next program, also in January, it's going to be in 2 weeks' time, is the story of one family. We're going to see a film called Unbroken, which has been an audience favorite at all the Jewish film festivals. It's a story, the true story, of 7 German Jewish siblings who survived the Holocaust together, the 7 of them. Not with their parents, just the 7 of them. Then they finally arrive in America in 1946, only to be separated by the United States foster care system. They lost track of each other for 40 years, then were reunited, and that's what the film is about. It is a must-see, and I really encourage you to sign up for the program. Right now, we're going to see a little trailer of the film.
We were put in the back of the Schmidt's truck
He took us in the middle of the night out to the farm.
because he had heard they were going to come for us.
We were on a truck.
I was terrified. Everybody was terrified.
All it was a tarp on the outside.
But we were already registered to be shipped off to Auschwitz.
I never thought they would tell me their story.
We were 7 Jewish children who came over here together.
But one fragment at a time,
That's Mama.
they give me something to hold on to.
She put us into danger by doing what she was doing.
He kept telling her not to do it because she said, you're going to get caught.
My memory of her is when she was taken away.
And she said, it's all right. These people need to get out. You don't go through what he did in a camp and walk away emotionally whole. You're broken.
I guess there's just something about seeing original source documents that's so emotional.
After she was killed, my father said we had to go be baptized.
Alexander took all the children to Berlin. That would have been extremely dangerous.
My father said, we got to get out of here now.
All of the Soviet troops will go to Berlin, and fighting there was very, very cruel and very, very dangerous.
You learn to lie to survive.
Can you describe how you feel right now?
A little overwhelmed.
There is so much evil in the world that is always overcome by so much goodness.
Is courage something that can be learned, or are you born with it?
Und wenn der Mut nicht herausgefordert wird, dann weiß man ja
It
gar
is
nichts davon.
incumbent upon us to remember that the good always outweighs the evil.
This is a film that will just carry you away, and it's really so beautifully done. I urge all of you to sign up. Then our first February program is on a different subject. It's about D-Day, but not the way that we normally think of D-Day. This is D-Day from the perspective of the French. It's a film called The Girl Who Wore Freedom, and it's about the attitude of the people of Normandy towards D-Day and the commemoration of it. And it's another very touching film, and here is the trailer.
As an American, I probably know more about World War II than any other war in our history. But I had no idea how little I really knew about the soldiers that fought and died for my freedom. I knew even less about the men, women, and children they liberated. Until this D-Day. This is the D-Day that changed me. And it's where I truly learned about freedom.
My name is Daniel Patrix. 1 year after being liberated from German control, I found myself standing in a ceremony on Utah Beach, wearing a new dress sewn by my mother Cecile. It was made from parachutes of the soldiers who fought valiantly to liberate me, my family, my neighbors, and all of France from Hitler's terrible grasp.
In Normandy, celebrations of remembrance and gratitude take place every year. French citizens bring World War II veterans and their families to Normandy to share their stories. In doing so, the French, once liberated by the Americans, liberate these soldiers in return from their oppressive memories of war.
Freedom is not free. It's too important to never forget.
That some boys went ashore on our beaches to fight in a hell, to liberate people they even didn't know. Then you realize what they have done and the sacrifice that many of them have made.
Dans tous les cimetières, il y a eu tant de morts pour sauver la France et tous les pays qui étaient occupés par l'Allemagne. Où qu'on serait aujourd'hui, nous Français, si vous les Américains, vous n'étiez pas venus.
The Americans, they are our liberator. We have to thank them forever, really.
The Girl Who Wore Freedom is an unconventional love story between the people of Normandy and the American GIs who freed them from German occupation that continues today.
These are our stories, Normandy's stories.
Great. So now let's get to your questions. So right now, let me start with some questions for Louis, and it has to do with comparing Minot with Vishniac. The question is, Minot and Vishniac seem to have both shot similarly with cameras hidden under their coats, although Minot shot more panoramic or city shots than the close-up portraits of Vishniac. I'm wondering your feelings about that, and if you could also tell us a little bit more about that Kodak Brownie camera.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that question, or a couple of questions together. Yeah, one thing I want to say about Vishniac is, you know, I understand you had a program on him a year ago or so, yes? And I'm imagining you guys focused very much on the later work in the ghettos that he took under commission from the Joint in order to see the conditions of the shtetls and particularly the religious life of the Jews right before their destruction. This work that I'm interested in, though, is I think lesser known work, and it's work that comes from his earlier period in Berlin. And it's fascinating, the parallels to Minot, because, you know, you've got this recent moment of political shift to the right, where there are not formally a ban yet, but where one could get into trouble shooting things that go beyond the private into the public. And that's why, of course, he used Mara as a decoy. I saw there was another question asking about whether Mara Vishniac-Cohn is still alive. No, unfortunately, you know, she passed away a couple of years ago, but all of the work of Vishniac, she now donated to the Magnus Museum, which is now located at the University of California, Berkeley. So for those of you, and they're doing shows, they're in the process of archiving and cataloging all of that material. But no, I think it's really an interesting comparison between these two figures. And yeah, I mean, in terms of concealing a Kodak Brownie, it's a little bulky. So it's kind of not that easy to do so. I mean, but obviously you have that impression for both of them working as a kind of detectives, using these cameras literally undercover and then, you know, exposing themselves so that they can get the shot. And of course, it was very risky business. And that, I think, adds to the kind of admiration that we have for the courage of both of these photographers and what they were able to do and what they were able to record for posterity. Thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. This next question is for Susan, and it has to do with Bastille Day, because somebody astutely noted that the photo that was taken at that metro station of Richelieu-Drouot, or whichever metro station it was on Bastille Day 1940. I'm wondering if there might have been particular police presence on such a day that would give rise to fervent French, patriotic feelings. And then similarly, 2 years later, when there was the roundup of Jews, 2 days after Bastille Day, July 16th, wondering if there was also a connection of, was it the Germans trying to show the French who was in charge?
So 2 different incidents at different times. In July of 1940, was so soon after the occupation that there was not much opposition expressed yet, except that Raoul Minot was active. But there were demonstrations very often by students or teenagers or kids. Not always. There was one organized resistance group, but not a military one that came out of the Musée de l'Homme. But mostly it was individual. So yes, on July of 1940, throughout Paris, the kids began to march and protest. They were stopped pretty quickly, and but they continued their clandestine distribution of flyers until it became apparent that this was really risking one's life. But yes, my assessment of Paris during the occupation was brief and it was general, but there were demonstrations as early as July 1940 at the Bastille. But it was totally nonviolent and primarily very young people. I don't know the answer to why. I know that for July of 1942, for the roundup in Paris, the first really huge roundup of Jewish men, women, and children had originally been planned for Bastille Day, and it was postponed until 2 days later. That's really all I know. I don't know who decided that Bastille Day might be a clever time to have it, whether it was intentional or mistaken, just a coincidence that it was chosen for July 14th. But I do know that they did figure out that major roundups on the 14th, on Bastille Day, was not a clever choice, and it would be better to put it off, and they did. So that's what I know.
So, Eleanor, there are a lot of questions for you. I'm trying to figure out which to prioritize here.
I can answer this.
There are a number of questions having to do with that photo album. So can you clarify whatever you can tell us about the album? I mean, the cover note is unsigned, right? So who put it? What can you
No, I think nobody knows that yet. I think a lot more. Well, when I met the woman who found it, I said, "Where is it today?" And she said, "I have it. I mean, I think it's under, lock and key somewhere." There's going to be a lot more on this. There's going to be probably a movie. There's going to be, so I really don't know. But that was the whole thing about the investigation. Was it the same person who took the pictures that wrote the snarky comments? Who put this album together? No, nobody knew. At least at the time when this is all really just so recent. I mean, the picture of Raoul Minot came out after they had published all these articles. And that, I met Philippe Broussard, I think the day, I'm not sure, he had just, he hadn't even seen his picture yet. Somebody had just contacted him. And so this is all just breaking still. That's why it's just so stunning. But yeah, those are the questions. Who put this album together? Why were they dispersed? Clearly, different people had pictures. The woman at Le Printemps had some of her colleagues' pictures. But how did this Paul Leduc, whose father was in the resistance, but gone, so nobody could ask him? So I don't know. I can't answer that, but maybe some of these things will come out.
And there are also some questions having to do with that letter of denunciation, which is also anonymous. So one of our audience members suggests maybe it's possible to do some forensics, like some maybe DNA analysis on the stamp on that letter and so forth.
Yeah.
maybe you can
I
submit.
suppose you could, but then what would you compare it to? Who could have done this? I know Broussard told me he lives a little bit out of Paris and he takes the train in every day to Saint-Lazare, and every day, and that's where that letter was posted from the station at Saint-Lazare. And he goes by Le Printemps every day, and he says, I still think about this every day. He said, I'm thinking of Raoul Minot literally every single day. Yeah, who knows who did that? A lot of people denounced people. You didn't know who you could trust, and yeah, that's a good idea. But what would you compare it to? It could have just been anybody. It was clearly probably someone at the store.
Somebody writes, if the stamp licker's descendants ever did 23andMe or Ancestry, the DNA would be there. So,
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
so anyway, just a thought. Then on another set of questions having to do with Minot himself, people are very, very curious about his own motivation. You mentioned he didn't have any descendants, right? He had one daughter who predeceased the mother, and presumably she had no children. So there's nobody who can like further expand the story, unless there may be more distant relatives. I don't know. And there's a question.
They were from a town called Montluçon in the center of France, apparently, and that's where Marthe and the daughter are buried, and then his body is in Bavaria. But yeah, I suppose if they had other colleagues, if something could come to light, but there was nothing in the series about that.
So there's a question, was he a religious man? Was he Catholic? But there's no way to know these things.
There's no way to know. I mean, he was culturally Catholic probably, because most people in France are, but that doesn't mean he was religious. I don't know why I want to say, I get the feeling he was not, but just because of the sarcasm in his notes, and he seemed like an irreverent character more than a pious character. And but yeah, he fought in World War I, so I think he was just incensed from the beginning that this was happening. That was part of it, and then yeah.
And then there's a whole series of questions having to do with the dissemination of Minot's photographs during the war. I mean, he was sort of caught in the act because he was denounced, and then his camera and materials were seized and so forth. But clearly, they were disseminated somewhat. I think that the cover note in the album mentions that there was at least one photo that turned up in London. So what can you tell us about who actually saw these photos during the war?
Well, I don't know. I think that probably after he was deported, people hid them. I'm sure that they were, he was taking them with his wife. I'm just imagining they were given out to a small knit group. I mean, the one, Paul Leduc, who gave the pictures to the museum, his father was in the resistance. His father probably knew Minot. This other woman worked at Le Printemps. But I was trying to remember if I had seen these pictures before. Maybe I've been to that museum and seen them before. I feel like I have. And it's weird that nobody has tried to find him before. That's what I find strange. So I don't really know. But I would think that if he was deported, I would think if you had copies of these pictures, you would hide them. But what's so strange is for 80 years they've been around, in this album. Where did this album come from? Why wasn't it discovered before? It's strange.
And then there's a question that just came in. Why wasn't his wife arrested? But she was arrested, wasn't she?
She was arrested, and who knows? I mean, he was probably clearly seen as the principal person, and he was taken, and that punished her too. For him to be deported was just terrible for her as well. So
yes. And in answer to the question that just came in, yes, we are recording this program, and you'll be able to watch it again on our YouTube channel. So absolutely. Fantastic. So now let's turn to our final thoughts. And we're going to start with you, Louis. What would you like to say to our audience in closing today?
Well, just to, I guess, reiterate for me how I think it's really important what this particular subject shows, and why I'm attracted to it is, I work sort of at the crossroads between photography and humor. And I think that in Minot's work, we see embodied or intertwined the way in which both of these things can function in relationship to subversion and resistance. That photography can be an act of resistance, and humor, having a sense of humor, can be an act of resistance. And I think that's one of the things that really attract me to his work. And in the other photographers that I'm working on, and I think Emile put in the chat a link to a podcast that I did on 4 German Jewish photographers at the time. Well, 3, because one of them is Vishniak. But I think it's Vishniak, Greta Stern, John Hartfield, and Erwin Blumenfeld. And I think all of them and what they're doing, some of them earlier, but still within the same period, I think it would further illuminate some comparisons in relationship to Minot. So it would be great if people would be interested enough to check that out. Thank you.
And Louis, when are you going to bring Minot's photographs to an exhibition in North America?
Oh, that seems like a charge. Haven't thought about it, but it seems like this conversation today is really showing us there's a lot of interest. So we'll see where that goes.
Great. Susan, the floor goes to you now.
Well, for me, more than about Minot, actually, about the general French history at the period, thinking about it has really solidified my perception that millions of French people gave up on the Third Republic. They gave up on the democratic regime that had been their government since 1870, early 1870s, and opted for an autocratic, non-democratic, anti-Semitic, authoritarian regime under Philippe Pétain, rather than working for reform, moderate reform of the Third Republic. They opted for an authoritarian regime which would abolish a democratic system. And I think that's a lesson for us today to weigh the differences between moderate reform and extremism from both right and left as to the support from an existing democratic regime that needs reform, yes, but not abolition. So that's my thought.
Eleanor, the last word goes to
Yeah.
you.
First, I want to thank my colleagues, Louis and Susan, for the amazing context and depth they brought to all this. Wow, I loved it. I just want to say, I walk around Paris and you see, signs of World War II everywhere. There's plaques on the wall where people were gunned down by the Nazis, you put flowers there on Bastille Day. You go by a school, it gives the number of Jewish kids deported. And so you feel like it's all around you, but you feel like everything is known. Everything is known. And this was just stunning because nobody knew this. This is actually, and it made me feel that history was really alive and it was so close and that you could actually still find things out. And there's probably so many things we don't know. And that it really made history feel living and with us and important.
Great. Well, thanks for giving us a hero to honor. Amazing that in 2024, there's still heroes coming out of the woodwork. And this man, boy, he really suffered for his heroism.
I know, I'm so glad he's being honored.
And of course, his photos live on. So in that sense, he lives on, which is so wonderful. So I want to thank my fabulous panelists. This hour has just flown by. Of course, I want to thank the audience that comes very faithfully. I want to urge everybody to sign up for our upcoming programs. There are questions about how to see those films, Unbroken and The Girl Who Wore Freedom. Very simple, just sign up for our programs and we will send you those films. So we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Be well. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Olivia.